When I was invited to speak at this session, I saw the title of Industrial Strategy, Brexit and Skills, and suddenly realized that not only was that the title, but it was also the last session, and that makes it the mother of all hospital passes. And then I saw social care was on before, and I thought that looks like child's play compared to trying to pull all this together into a proper answer. So you'll have to forgive me if I show an awful lot of editorial prejudice in how I hang these things together and how I talk about it to you today. So a friend and I were talking recently. This friend works in government. And we were talking about how policy transitions from one minister to another, from one government to another, from one party even to another. And we were talking about a pretty significant infrastructure project. Let's call it high-speed fail. And he said to me, look, Liam, what you need to understand about governing is that so much of it is like that film, Salmon Fishing in the Yemen. He said, you turn up on day one, and I handed a briefing document saying the government is committed to a salmon fishery. However, it turns out that not only is the salmon fishery completely unfeasible, it's now dramatically undercosted and is going to cost you £10 billion more. Oh, and the person that was nominally responsible for deciding to build said fishery, the former minister, has just appeared on the Today programme announcing he has grave concerns about the viability of the project and that it probably shouldn't happen. So as I thought about what I was going to say to you today, my mind jumped to that. That was an actual conversation, by the way. I'm not making that up. That's not a joke. When I was asked to speak today, my mind went straight to that chat, that little ditty, and about the question that sits behind it, really, which is how do you ensure that something like the industrial strategy, and to an extension Brexit as well, of course, doesn't fall foul of the same trap? And for the purpose of what we're going to talk about today, how do you marry together those big questions of the industrial strategy and Brexit together in a way that gives meaning to both of those issues beyond the lifespan of this government into future ones? Our recent report, In Place of Work, which some of you may or may not have read, and our previous work on the industrial strategy as well, back in March, The Making of an Industrial Strategy, has tried to tell a story about the shape of England and about how England has an identity that isn't reflected enough in politics and policy, and that place matters. In our recent work, we really tried to tell a story about the shape of England's labour markets and how they were changing, and I'm very grateful to CCN for supporting that work as well. We looked at the relative strength of England's labour markets because we had decided that actually the thing that is not the only, but one of the most powerful connections between the industrial strategy and Brexit is actually our labour market, our skills base, and how we're generating a future resilient labour market post-Brexit with a new immigration system, with changes in technology coming down the line. And what we found was what I would consider to be quite frankly staggering. And I want to share with you just 6 findings from the report. So the first is that the sub-regional variation that we saw was so severe that the idea of looking at our work and then saying that, yes, a national approach to managing and curating a future labour market, I just think wouldn't have any credibility. I don't see how anyone in government can actually look at the data that we produced in the report. The FT have independently analysed it. It appeared on Peston on Sunday as part of their Geek of the Week section, so if you haven't seen it, watch it. It's gone through the mill. This stuff is very robust. The idea that government can now say we're just going to have a national labour market strategy to solve the problems of a post-Brexit migration system and our low educational attainment levels just isn't credible. The thing that really struck me is how what looks like a lifeline to one local economy is very much the death sentence to another as well. I think automation is a really interesting example throughout the course of the report. We took a place like Gloucestershire, for example, where the number of jobs created is more than the population growth in an area, suggesting that actually some level of automation would be very, very helpful to keep their economy vibrant. Take it to the West Midlands, however, where its industrial makeup means it's quite exposed to the threats posed by automation. What you're looking at is significantly extended dole queues. Now, government needs to place itself in that gap between the right place and the wrong place. Paul Cllr, in his wonderful book Exodus, which if you haven't read it, definitely read it. It's all about our national discourse around immigration. Says that asking whether these things are good or bad, automation, immigration, is kind of like asking whether eating is good or bad. The point is that too much of the wrong stuff at the wrong time is very bad for you. But the right stuff in the right amount, and in the context of this work, in the right place, actually is good, and actually fundamental and entirely necessary to our continued prosperity and existence. Second finding, when we were looking at the history of, I suppose, the confluence between industrial strategy and skills, which I'm using the phrase labour market to describe, in the history of this country, there hasn't actually ever been a formal labour market strategy. If you type that phrase into the gov.uk search engine, you get 3 responses: a biography, a court repeals notice, and a press release. There isn't actually any document. Scotland produced its first one last year. Now, it's not that we haven't been thinking about it, it's just that a lot of the strands that would make up a labour market strategy exist in other departments. I think now is a really unique time to pull that together. And why that matters is a significant amount of assumption in previous policy, particularly as it comes to employment, is based on this idea that we can tap into the long-term unemployed as a future source of labour. Well, after 2-3 decades of having a crack at that and not really making huge progress, I feel pretty confident in asserting that it's not going to help us in the next 10 years either. And actually we need to get far cuter and more targeted in how we approach trying to transition those who are currently outside of the labour market into it. And in the report, we suggest that actually locally there's something quite powerful you can do. You can focus on the disabled and the over 50s. Well, there's a really powerful cost incentive actually to local authorities to engage and transition those people into work, and where there's quite a high degree of local discretion actually in terms of the support you can provide. There's an awful lot of work already happening in that space. It's a really interesting test bed. Third fact, I don't know if you remember when Liam Fox got recorded saying that British business was too fat and lazy to boost the country's prosperity, and he got panned for it. The irony is actually he wasn't entirely wrong. He wasn't wrong, really. Business investment in high-risk industries in the UK, according to the OECD, and by high risk I mean those judged independently to be most at risk of a labour supply squeeze post-Brexit and long-term automation. Those industries, those businesses, are dramatically below OECD average in terms of their capital investment in technology and training. Liam Fox, to a degree, was right. Is those businesses who are going to be most affected by the changes in the economy over the next 20 years are the least likely to actually proactively do anything about supporting their workforce or modernizing their business processes. That's quite a significant risk. Fourth point, the UK is again below OECD average in its provision of technical education. We're 16th out of 20 of the top 20 countries, in provision for just straight technical education. We're about to fall to 28th out of 32 for upper secondary, which is MVQ level 3. And furthermore, actually, UK apprenticeships don't necessarily meet the standard of what other developed countries would classify as an apprenticeship. So in 2015, only a fifth of starts, that's kind of new apprenticeships, or just a little over 100,000, were reserved for the 16 to 24-year-old bracket at the more advanced level, which would be recognised as an apprenticeship in many other countries. So the government's investment in apprenticeships is fantastic, and it's entirely right, but the idea that we're making big leaps forward here is just not true. There's so much further for us to go, and it feels like progress because we're starting from such a low base. Fifth point. Employer-sponsored training in this country is incredibly poor, and it's incredibly unequally distributed as well. Significant proportion of the money spent by businesses on upskilling their staff goes on high-paid, highly qualified executives. Already stories are appearing in the press about the way the apprenticeship levy is being used to fund MBAs. Now, look, I don't have a problem with businesses choosing to do that if that's what they want to do. But if you're government, it seems to me that policy was not designed for that. It was designed for something very, very different, for a very different cohort of people in our population. Last point I'll make is the aging of the population. I'm sure you talked about it in the social care stuff before. I want to give you a slight variant on this, which is much more about geography. 2/3 of the world's population live on the coast, or in a coastal place. Our country is moving in the opposite direction. There's a great inversion happening within England at the very least, where our coastal areas are depopulating and becoming older, and people are being sucked into the centre, to London and the home counties, the Golden Triangle between it and Cambridge, parts of Manchester, some of the big city areas, Leeds. That's quite interesting. I don't I don't really have any kind of further analysis other than to say that we seem to be bucking an international trend. So how do I sum all this up in one kind of pithy quote you can take away? And I found it. It took me a good month of reading as part of the report we just produced. And it's this from the OECD. In most countries, but not in England, younger people have stronger basic skills than the generation of people approaching retirement. That's our problem in a nutshell. Is it the future generations aren't as well skilled or suited to the economy as the older ones? Now, we framed our recent report in Place of Work with the idea that one of the biggest threats to making a success of Brexit won't necessarily come from Brussels. It will come from our own people. And it's that problem, is that we're just not creating enough of the right skilled individuals needed to fill the jobs that our economy is creating. Now, I'm not going to leaden you with the recommendations from the report, other than to say that we argue for a much greater role locally as part of the industrial strategy and beyond. And our report shows to my mind that, kind of beyond any reasonable doubt, that a national labour market approach is completely insubstantial, and that what we need is far more local discretion and local powers. So if you haven't had a scan of the report, do read it. All your areas are covered, lots of data, lots of interesting maps. It's very, very pithy to read, at least the exec summary is. The rest of it, maybe not so. So I've covered a little bit of that. What I want to move on to now, and I don't know, how long have I got? About 5 minutes? Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about the industrial strategy more directly. So what is it that we know, and what are the questions it poses? So sorry for the sort of about turn on this, but because it's coming out on Monday, I think it's worth reflecting on that a little bit. So it was moved from today, so they didn't want it to run into the budget kind of briefing process, which I'm not quite sure why that's happened. So there's a question for me whenever government moves announcements around, particularly as it is around budget time. Was it a deliberate approach to suggest that it was going to be announced sort of trailed by the budget, or was it just kind of government incompetence? And I think that I'll leave that up to you to decide, I guess. From what I've heard from conversations with senior civil servants in Bays, DCRG, and Treasury Number 10, the document is likely to be very high level, was the word I got. Very, very high level. And that's because they're gearing up for lots of iterations. I've also been told that these things, whatever is created from it, is likely to be years in the making. So the phrase they used to me was we want to sort of prototype quite a lot of it for the first 12 months. I'm very pleased that there's going to be a really significant focus on local industrial strategies as part of the document. That was something that Localis first called for back in March, made its way into the Tory manifesto in June, and is now going to become formal policy. So I'm really delighted that they've understood that you can't do this stuff from Whitehall. However, and if you read anything I've written recently for one of the trade mags, you'll know that I'm not a very big fan of the idea of LEPs leading these things. And it seems, from what I've heard, that they are going to be put into the driving seat with it. That's a huge problem, and I'll get on to why I think that's a big problem in a second. There'll be some development of sectoral deals. However, government's been really disappointed with the response that business has given it on basically what it can do to support sectors developing. And that's largely because many of the things that we think are sectors, or the things that government would say are sectors, the sectors themselves don't recognise as being part of. Or, lo and behold, businesses are very protective of their IP. They don't like the idea of getting in a room and sharing a lot of secrets about their strategy and what they consider to be the big risks and threats. And then finally, a little bit more kind of policy wonkish stuff. If you remember the Green Paper, they talked about the 10 pillars. That's now being reduced to 5 foundations, apparently. And a little bit of that was covered in the weekend, so subtle shift there. So where does that leave us? There are 3 questions I think are most important, 3 kind of areas of tension. The first is around the Shared Prosperity Fund. So I've pushed very, very hard and got very, very little back in terms of A, what the level of funding will be, and B, what the strings attached to that will be as well. I think they're very much looking for a response from the sector. I think the default position is let's continue with the way the current sort of funding mechanisms operate in terms of what it's replacing and see how much we can make it look as much like that as possible. The second point that I think is worth reflecting on, second tension, is around this LEPs business and their accountability and capability to deliver on a local industrial strategy. Some LEPs are great. Some I consider to be pretty woeful. I don't mind saying that. I think I wrote, are they functional economic geographies? No, they're entirely subjective. If there are best attempts to map functional economic geographies, I would laugh. Okay, I'm not saying counties are better. I don't think they are the answer. And that's largely when you look at the number that are overlapping as well. I mean, I think the LEP's point here is quite important. I think government's going to run into a lot of problems around its governance and accountability. Again, not everywhere is bad, not every LEP is terrible. It's just I think that if you're trying to approach what is quite a complex national policy, setting quite a complex national policy framework and wanting it then to be delivered locally, you probably want a little bit more stability and consistency in who is delivering it for you at that local level. One of the things that's really come about from researching all the documents around economic development within the UK and just kind of the last 30 years of regeneration strategies is the current level of inequity that is baked into the system already in terms of capability. I'll give you one proxy example. London's most recent economic strategic assessment weighs in at 738 pages. The most recent LEP one I read was about 40. I'm not saying because it's longer it's better. I'm just saying that as a proxy it tells you something about just the level of resource that some areas will have compared to others. I think that's a particular concern if you're a rural area as well, where you may not have some of the capacity and capability. Some of this stuff may even be new. I'm not sure it will be, but some of it certainly will be. And then finally, I guess it's what comes next. The industrial strategy will be years in the making. Local industrial strategies, I imagine, also will be years in the making. And once the first phase of this has landed, which will come next week, there will naturally be a push for more, and I think that's the space in which CCN, others, counties can start to articulate how government takes the idea forward. Our two major reports this year, The Making of an Industrial Strategy and In Place of Work, are really pitched at that next phase. What is it that you can do beyond what the government sets out in the white paper? And my hope as well is that that work and the kind of the dialogue and the conversation will act as a trigger for more creative thinking around devolution and around skills and around labour markets and around economic growth. So kind of how to wrap up now. I guess the industrial strategy is the other side of the coin to Brexit. That's the way I'm thinking about it. You kind of have Brexit as the dominant foreign policy agenda and the industrial strategy as the dominant domestic agenda. And I don't presume to understand the reasons for why Britain voted for Brexit, but I do take it as the moment in which a more general dissatisfaction with our political and economic model manifested. And that dissatisfaction is characterized by the widely held belief that our economic and political model benefits a small elite located in a small corner of the country. And understanding that is as important to understanding the industrial strategy as it is to understanding Brexit. Because if the government draws its legitimacy from this quiet revolution of the vote to leave the EU, it stands to reason that any action taken in response to that is a response to that source of legitimacy. And that's a bit of a long-winded way of saying the government's new industrial strategy is driven as much by the political need to address that general discontent with the way the benefits of growth are shared, as it is by a broader goal of national GDP or productivity increasing. And that means local places having a greater influence over the effects of globalization and a lot more power locally to encourage greater economic prosperity. So finally, look, for a politician who makes pragmatism a key aspect of her public persona, it's really interesting that Theresa May has chosen what I would characterize as quite French, sort of grand projet style policy agendas. You know, the industrial strategy is this big, hulking, nebulous thing that means many different things to many different people. And I think it's in the grandness of the idea you sort of find at least part of the answer as to how we, as people interested in the local, should respond to that. Jonathan Powell, Blair's chief of staff in Number 10, wrote a book called The New Machiavelli, and in it he said that a good leader should think about their legacy from the first day, and I think that's what the Prime Minister is doing. The industrial strategy is a legacy project. It will need to live beyond that government. And that's where I come back to right at the start, the kind of salmon fishing in the Yemen. How do you make the industrial strategy meaningful to the government that comes after this one and to the government that comes after that? And I think that's how local government can play a really important role in this and how it can take the agenda forward. It's that enthusiasm locally. It's that kind of activism around bringing networks together to make things happen. And it means also fueling a constant dialogue and a stream of ideas about the right powers and the right sort of devolution to the right place. I think if local government can understand how it does that, with help from others like us and CCN and lots of other bodies, Res Publica here yesterday as well, if you can find a way of doing that and keep fueling that conversation, under the guise of the industrial strategy, with that goal in mind of it's a legacy project. This is years beyond all of us. I think it could actually be quite a powerful cover for quite a significant transfer of power. Remember, 2019 is 10 years on from the government, well, the Conservative Party's pretty impressive document at the time, Control Shift, if you remember it, which did usher in, whether you like the government or not, a pretty significant transfer of power in the last 8 years. I think that's a really interesting point at which to reassess actually what the next shift in power is going to be, particularly because I think if we get it right, we can reshape the economy for the benefit of our people. Thank you.
Now we move on to Kevin Bentley, our man in Brussels and Strasbourg, who is chairing the LGA Task and Finish Group on the impact of Brexit on local government. Kevin, over to you.
Paul, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, first of all, congratulations on hanging on what's in fact the last speech of this most excellent conference. It negates the first line of my speech, which says, thank you both for being here. And I bring some good news and I bring some bad news. Now, the good news is, just before I came on, Paul Carter said to me, Bentley, you tend to bang on a bit, so whatever you're going to say, can you cut it in half? I've done that. That's the good news. The bad news is it's still 3 hours long, so settle back and enjoy. I just wanted to update you in a few minutes that I have here about the work of the Task and Finish Group, what we're doing for the LGA and Brexit. And indeed, if you don't know about the Task and Finish Group, let me just tell you about some of the history and why we're here. So shortly after the referendum, we were, all of us, very clear, very quickly, that local government plays a big part in the Brexit negotiations. You won't see us on the television, you won't see us in the squabbling and the sound bites and all the other things that seems to be going on in the media. And I want to say first and foremost that both at the local government level and the national government level, there's some really talented people working on this and working very hard on this as well, and none more so than in the LGA. And I'm very privileged to work with a lot of those officers who do that work. But what we want to establish was that firm voice, and Lord Porter went to the government minister and he said, or to the Prime Minister, and said that local government needs a seat at the negotiating table, and we do. So the 4 local government national bodies, which is the LGA, the body in Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, sit down with DEX ministers and also with civil servants as well, and work through some of the work and some of the issues that directly affects us in local government. And the Task and Finish Group is the working group of that negotiated team that goes in and sees government ministers. And in the LGA's purpose, it is cross-party. So I sit there with colleagues of all different parties, and one thing we absolutely don't talk about is whether Brexit is good or bad. We have our own views, but we leave those at the door. We have a job to do on your behalf that you have tasked us to do, and that is get the best deal we possibly can for local government. And there are a number of areas that we are looking at. One of the prime areas is the Committee of the Regions, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. Some of you may have sat on in your time. We have former MEPs like Roy here who would have worked very closely with the Committee of the Regions in the past. It is a body that is made up of regional and local government from across Europe and has direct input and consultation rights on EU legislation. And we were very keen that when those powers are transferred back to the UK, that we in local government have those same rights. Now, what we don't want is another institution set up like the Committee of the Regions, but we do want that ability to negotiate through the LGA and the other 3 national bodies directly with the UK government about what we want to do, and if legislation affects us, what our views are in that legislation. And I'm very pleased to say that the government are listening to that. They have taken that on board and they're working with us to hopefully amend the bill that actually will allow us to do that. So already we've had some real traction with the LGA working and the other associations working directly with government. One of the other areas we're looking at, of course, is funding. Now, we hear a lot about the divorce bill, the divorce settlement. What does it mean? A lot of that will be involved in funding which actually we are committed to, and a lot of organisations and people, and indeed local government, are receiving some of that money back already. So what we do know is that when that comes to an end and we have exit day and the divorce settlement bill, whatever that looks like, we've had news today that may increase, when that's over and we have exit day, we still need to fund a lot of these projects, certainly in local government. What does that look like? Well, the government's response has been the Prosperity Fund, which you've heard about. We may well get some news on that tomorrow in the autumn statement. We don't know. We certainly put a bid in from the LGA to talk about that and from the Task and Finish Group to talk about that. What we do know is that we do have to make sure that whatever we have in this Prosperity Fund, it is much easier to access for people, it's much more straightforward than we currently have, and the funds are channeled directly to those organisations that help to build the economy and help with our skills funding as well. A lot of funding around ESIF, around ERDF, and of course around leader programmes directly involved in that. So that's one of the areas we look at. Another area we look at, of course, is state aid and procurement. What's that going to look like after we have exit day? And of course, procurement is very important. You know, ODU at the moment, we have to go through that process. You will have to go through that process when you're tendering for contracts. What does that look like when we bring that back? This is work, detailed work, we're now working with the government on. And also state aid. Will there be the equivalent to UK state aid once we have exit day? And what does that mean? So many of you are involved in the UK broadband rollout. I certainly am at Essex. Many of you will be doing that in your own counties, and you will know there are certain areas of your county you cannot go into because commercial operators are there and state aid rules prevent you from doing it. What are we going to do to make that easier, to make sure actually at the end of the day it's about a service to the public, and that's what we must be fundamentally aware of at all times. It's a service to the public. So what are we going to do to make sure state aid, if it exists in its current form, can become easier and much more user-friendly for everyone involved in that particular area? And of course, there are other things. We put a call out to all local government, and I hope you took part in this, and if not, you still have the chance to do it for calling out for evidence of other areas. And one of those areas we hadn't totally thought about, but we have now, because that came up as a result of call for evidence, is trading standards. So for those of us who have airports and seaports, of course, that's customs. But you will know a lot of our trading standing officers actually work very closely with customs in those areas. What is that going to mean for local government? Will they need more training, more skills, more people to be able to do that? So again, we are discussing that with government at the moment. So this is just a very quick update for you all to let you know that this is a piece of work that's going on quietly in the background. So you won't see us in the national media, you won't see us in the local media when it really comes to that. But actually we are working very hard on your behalf, but more importantly on all of our residents' behalf, to make sure that their views and their rights, and also the services they receive, are going to be brought back in a way that we can deliver them at the very local level. And the one thing I just want to leave you with in all of this, and all the discussions that we have, and it strictly is non-party political, we absolutely get down and do the work, that in every single thing that we do on this Task and Finish group, we have one thought on our mind. Because this is about real people, real jobs, real families, and real livelihoods. They are looking to us to get this right, and I promise you, we will. Thank you.
Right, we've got 10 minutes for questions and comments on the devolution agenda around the industrial strategy, the establishment of prosperity funds, and the devolution to place. Is it going to be LEPs? Is it going to be empowered county councils as strategic counties or not? Gentleman from Cornwall.
Thank you. Some of you may be aware that Cornwall received very substantial funding from the European Union, which has made a substantial difference to it, not least in the case of acquiring a university, you know, which has had a very beneficial economic impact. It seems increasingly apparent that the Shared Prosperity Fund is going to be channeling a lot less money into Cornwall than the European regeneration funding. So I'd like Kevin to do something about that, right, if possible, because we're pretty worried. A number of projects which we were hoping to develop are already in doubt, even in the town I represent, Penzance. The other question I had about industrial strategy, right? I mean, it's not exactly a startling revelation that British business isn't very good at investing in technology and skills. I mean, I always like to hear somebody well-informed tell me that, but it's not, it's old news. Surely an industrial strategy is pretty meaningless unless there's a lot of resources behind it to fill that gap.
Liam, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I guess I take the last bit. No, it's not news. So good point there, I guess. What makes it relevant, however, is that the government has basically devolved skills policy to businesses. That's why it matters. That they're terrible at doing it. Well, lots of them are pretty bad at doing it. When you actually pass down the apprenticeship levy expenditure to businesses to spend directly, it matters what their track record is in spending money on things like that. So I think you're right, it's not news, but I think the idea, because it's not news, we shouldn't be really up on it, and coming up with ways to help support businesses to make better investments, I still think is really, really relevant, yeah. I mean, I think you would know better on the position on Cornwall or the EU funding a university, so I'll sort of leave that one alone.
And Kevin, how are you going to help Cornwall?
Cornelius, yes, I'll sort that for you. It's no problem at all. It'll be done. You make a very good point. Cornwall is a very good example of funding that's received from the EU. Everyone does it. Everyone in this room will receive some shape or form funding from the EU. It'd be a very good exercise if you don't know to go back and ask your officers how much your county receives in EU funding. I guarantee you will be surprised when you get the answer. Cornwall, though, does receive an awful lot for various reasons, and hence I made the point that we are very much holding the government's feet to the fire on this prosperity fund. There must be parity. The Prime Minister has already said there will be parity come exit day. We are testing that first and foremost on the funding, because you heard me say it's people, families and jobs and livelihoods at stake here, and we cannot allow there to be a reduction in that funding we receive, because if we're not paying the sub in, we can spend it in the UK, can't we?
Yeah. I mean, I've had this conversation with Kevin about the application of European grant funding in our counties. I think we ought to do exactly what he suggested and look at how much money has flowed into our various counties and for what. How much of it has been well invested and well spent, and much of that's been match funded. Some of it has gone on nonsenses, some of it's gone on good stuff. But therefore, what will we do when we know the totality of that and the outcomes that it's derived, and work out if Prosperity Fund money, or however it is badged, comes back into that arena, 50% of what we're currently getting from Europe or whatever, how would we make much better application of the totality of that money, or 70% of or 50% thereof in our communities? Because I think that's what we should be pitching for. When they don't have to pay the bill to be in Europe any longer, we want to make sure that that money is repatriated and devolved to place, hopefully counties, in the future. Anybody else want to come in? Keeping you from your lunch, I know. Yeah, gentleman at the back, on the left, or my left.
Malcolm Brown, also from Cornwall Council, but on a different tack. I was surprised the comment the first speaker made about population growth moving away from coastal areas in Cornwall inland, because certainly for many decades, some of the fastest growing parts of the country have been the coastal parts of the south. You know, for example, Cornwall, but also Dorset have been up in the top, 4 or 5 areas for rates of growth. So I didn't understand the basis for that. The other thing, I was wondering if he could also just say a bit more about his concern about the LEPs, whether it's the geography that they're covering too small an area, whether they have too rapid a turnover of board members, whether it's that they don't integrate properly with the local authority, and therefore that they're not answerable. I've got concerns about the LEP, but I'd be interested on a sort of broader perspective of what the speaker's thinking was.
It's not every coastal area. The report's called In Place of Work. It has maps on kind of demographic changes. You can see it. You can download it from our website. There may even be some copies at the conference here, I'm not sure. It's not every coastal area, so you're right. It's parts of the south have actually seen elevated population growth, absolutely. But it's just taken in aggregate that increasingly the population is moving, in general terms, away from coastal areas. Some will be outliers, of course, but there are more coastal areas declining than there are growing. And it does buck a trend that you see internationally. So it may not be the case in Cornwall. There may be some areas which are actually growing quite well, but across the country as a whole, they're not. On the LEPs point, why am I so concerned? It's not just me. It's the NAO, it's the Secretary of State, it's the Public Accounts Committee. All of them have raised serious concerns about accountability and governance and transparency. I also have concerns on top about the quality of board members. In some cases, the people from business are incredibly high quality, like fantastic, really, really good, really, really rate them, think they're brilliant. In other cases, it's not so. It's not been clear to me. I saw in one case, it's kind of the senior business person on the LEP is the person that manages the local warehouse. I mean, there are serious concerns. I do, and if you're pumping millions of pounds of money at the discretion of these non-statutory, because they were originally going to be statutory in the manifesto, but they're not now. We still haven't had the LEP review completed. The idea that we're giving these people the keys to kind of the local industrial growth car, I just think is, well, I don't think I'm mad for sort of waving my hand saying maybe we shouldn't do this.
Do you think there'll be a two-tier system with mayoral combined authorities and the city regions? They'll get the devolution through that route, and counties will have to put up with LEPs and perhaps making LEPs statutory bodies.
That's honestly, that's a real concern. It comes back to the point I was making about the inequity that's already baked in. If you are a combined authority area with a coterminous LEP and quite a high degree of sort of synergy between the two, you've got a pool of capacity there you can draw on that's been working together for quite some time. Political relationships are, one might argue, maybe better, maybe worse, I don't know. But I think there's just more cohesive capability and capacity there than you would get, for example, in a county area with maybe three LEPs kind of running through it or adjoining it, where there's quite a lot of competition around actually what the functional economic geography is. You could easily see, particularly think about like devolution deals, what's been one of the kind of key aspects of securing for the devolution? It's been a really robust evidence base. It's been quite detailed, painful, analytical work to make your case to the centre. Now, if you don't have the capacity to do that in your LEP, you as an area are disadvantaged, not for any fault of your own, but by dint of actually being beholden to them.
Anybody else like to come in? No? Well, in that event, can I thank Leanne for taking the time out to speak to us today, and to Kevin Bentley. Just a few closing remarks from myself. Thank you for being patient and remaining in the room and the attendance being good this morning. A few quick reflections from me. I think that we've had a most enjoyable, informative and fun conference. What we were hoping for at the start. Part of that is as a result of the input from the delegates. I think Giles Brandreth picked it up last night. We are a pretty happy bunch. We're a pretty cohesive force to be reckoned with across the County Council network. Government spends about 25% of public expenditure on local government, and we account for about 35 to 40% of that public expenditure in local government in our counties. I think the mood music from Sajid yesterday was really very, very positive, and I think a man that we can definitely do business with. And I think he showed that warmth towards us in his speech to conference and for the Conservatives in the room at our Conservative group meeting afterwards. I think from what we can read into his speech in the main forum is that we will be getting an extension. I hope we will be getting an extension to the transitional grant for another 2 years. And it is clear that he is working with his colleagues in Cabinet in allowing us to potentially have a change in regulation to allow us to start to impose modest charging for some of the services that we deliver, which will again help us in sorting out our medium-term financial plans. I personally particularly enjoyed the challenging presentation from Isabel Trowler on children's services. I thought that was very thought-provoking and lessons that we can all take back. And again, the second speaker, Lisa Pascoe, in a very refreshing new approach from Ofsted on how they're going to go about the inspection regime of children's services when they come knocking on our doors in the future. I thought them lightening up and trying to be much more helpful, constructive and proactive, as it were, in monitoring our progress in our safeguarding arrangements, excuse me, to keep keep young people safe in our communities. And my final words, an enormous thank you to Simon and the CCN team. They have done a stunning job.